April 7th, 1945. It should have been just another unremarkable morning over Tokyo Bay. The sea breeze carried a faint, briny scent across the smoldering ruins of the imperial capital, while the conical peak of Mount Fuji drifted in and out of the thin morning mist, standing like a silent observer. For the air defense spotters of the Japanese 10th Flying Division tasked with protecting the capital, this day was expected to be merely a continuation of the terror they had grown accustomed to. Their eyes were already trained to scan the heavens for a specific kind of nightmare. The massive, silver-glinting B-29 Superforged bombers, these Leviathans, always arrived with a rumble, casting long shadows of death from high altitude. But as the clock struck 7 in the morning, when the high-powered binoculars of the observation posts pierced through the cloud layers at 20,000 feet, the hands of the spotters began to tremble uncontrollably, a chill that had nothing to do with the altitude, and everything to do with primal fear shot down their spines. Because on this morning, flanking those lumbering, familiar B-29s was something that simply should not have been there. It was something that, in the cognitive framework of the Japanese military at the time, was a physical impossibility. Single-engine fighter planes, they appeared as 91 tiny, agile black dots, swarming like fierce sharks protecting a pod of whales, carving sharp, confident trajectories. Through the freezing winds of the stratosphere, these were the P-51 Mustangs. To the Japanese pilots on the ground, the psychological impact of this sight was even more devastating than the physical destruction that would follow. This was Tokyo. The nearest American base on Iwo Jima was 650 nautical miles away. The rear bases on Saipan were over 1,300 miles distant, in the common wisdom of propeller-era aviation. No single-engine fighter could possibly cross such a vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean carrying a full combat load, engage in a high-intensity dogfight over the enemy capital, and then have enough fuel to return home. Physics said it was impossible. Tactics said it was madness. Yet, as those silver wings flashed in the sunlight, and the first streams of .50 caliber tracer rounds lashed out like the whips of the Grim Reaper against the Japanese interceptors, all doubt evaporated. In that moment, before the first bomb even fell, every rational Japanese soldier understood a brutal truth. This war was effectively over. What remained was merely the bloody, agonizing garbage time of a lost cause. Let us push the camera ends forward, punch through the clouds, and enter the cockpit of the lead aircraft. Flying with the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, Major James taps it inside the bubble canopy of his P-51 Mustang, feeling a power that was nothing short of intoxicating. The cramped space smelled of a unique mixture of high-octane aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and nervous sweat, the scent of war. In front of him, a massive four-bladed propeller was spinning at a speed the human eye could not resolve, slicing through the thin air and dragging this multi-ton metal raptor higher into the sky. Major Tapp's hand gripped the control stick. It was not just a piece of metal, but a sensory tentacle connecting his nervous system to the machine. Beneath the Mustang's long, sleek nose lay a miracle of industrial engineering. The Rolls-Royce Merlin V1657 liquid-cooled engine built under license with obsessive precision by the Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit. If you appreciate mechanics, every detail of this heart would make you shudder with awe. It was not just a pile of steel, it was a kinetic sculpture. Equipped with a sophisticated stage-to-speed supercharger, this engine meant business. When Japanese engines relying on natural aspiration or primitive superchargers began to wheeze like asthmatics and lose power in the thin air above 25,000 feet, the Merlin continued to roar, outputting nearly 1,700 horsepower. This power redundancy gave the Mustang absolute dominion at these altitudes. It could look down on everything, choosing when to strike and when to disengage, while its opponents could only gaze upward, desperately trying to maintain their flight attitude. Embedded in the wings on either side of Major Tapp worse, browning them to heavy machine guns. Lying in wait like 6 starving beasts, these were not just iron tubes. They were scythes of death calibrated with near obsessive precision by American ground crews. They adjusted the angle of each gun so that their ballistic paths converged into a dense, lethal points several hundred yards in front of the nose. When the trigger was pulled, 6 tongues of fire erupted simultaneously. A rate of fire of 4,800 rounds per minute meant that every second, 80 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, each weighing 46 grams, were sprayed into the sky. This was not just shooting. This was a metal storm designed to cut through matter. This ammunition was powerful enough to shred the fragile aluminum skin of Japanese fighters in an instant, snap their wing spars, and detonate their unprotected fuel tanks. In previous battles, American pilots had witnessed this scene countless times. A Japanese fighter, licked only briefly by the Mustang's fire, would disintegrate like a paper kite or instantly turn into a massive fireball, plummeting into the abyss of the Pacific. Early Mustang models carried a staggering 2,800 rounds of ammunition, and although the later D model reduced this to 1,880 rounds to save weight and improve agility, it was still a terrifying number. By contrast, the Japanese Iro, the pride of the Imperial Navy, carried a pitiful amount of ammunition for its 20mm cannons, often running dry after just a few short bursts. In the split-second life or death struggle of an aerial dogfight, this order of magnitude difference in ammo capacity provided not just a tactical advantage, but a crushing psychological weight. An American pilot could afford to miss 10 times. A Japanese pilot could not afford to miss once. But the true secret of the Mustang, the reason Major Tapp could appear over Tokyo at all, lay in its impossible range. This fighter was, in essence, a flying fuel tank. Designers had stuffed fuel tanks into the fuselage and the wings. And it even carried two massive 110-gallon drop tanks under its wings. This gave it a combat radius of over 1,600 miles. It is a number that defies intuition. Imagine a pilot strapped into a narrow seat, surrounded by the deafening roar and vibration of the engine, flying continuously for 7 or 8 hours. He had to endure the extreme cold of high altitude, the pressure of the oxygen mask on his face, the muscle cramps from maintaining one posture, and the immense psychological pressure of navigating over a featureless ocean. In the Pacific, there were no road signs, no train stations, only an endless deep blue. One error with the compass, one miscalculation of fuel consumption, or a single hiccup from the engine, and the pilot faced the unforgiving sea. The only thing that made this possible, aside from the pilot's iron will, was a revolutionary aerodynamic design, the laminar flow wing. This wing profile, refined in the wind tunnels of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, reduced air resistance to unprecedented levels. Combined with the efficient Merlin engine, the P-51 burned fuel at a shockingly low rate while cruising. It was the perfect synthesis of American technological prowess, industrial design capability, and pilot training. However, in this moment of destiny, the Japanese Empire did not choose to surrender quietly. Although the tide had turned irrevocably, the spirit of Bushido still drove the last aerial samurai to take to the skies. In 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service played its final trump card. Arguably the finest fighter Japan produced during the entire war, the Nakajima Ki-80 for Height, known to the Allies as Frank. If you only looked at the data on paper, this was a world-class killing machine. It was equipped with the powerful HAM, or 18-cylinder radial engine, theoretically capable of 2,000 horsepower. It packed a heavy punch with two 20mm cannons and 12.7mm machine guns. And it even featured armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, luxuries rarely seen on previous Japanese aircraft. In testing, the Height had touched speeds of 680 km/h, and its low-altitude dogfighting performance was formidable. On that morning, over 100 Japanese interceptors of various types scrambled from airfields across the region to meet the incoming American formation. In an ideal laboratory environment, this should have been a clash of titans. A definitive duel between the Hayite and the Mustang for the title of King of the Skies. War is never fought in a laboratory. The reality of the battlefield amplifies every hidden crack in a nation's industrial foundation. When the Hayite met the Mustang, it was not just a collision of two aircraft. It was a collision of two industrial systems, a collision between a medieval workshop and a modern assembly line. The first thing to collapse was the power. Japan had designed the advanced hum or engine, yes. But by 1945, the shipping lanes bringing oil to Japan had been strangled by American submarines. The precious high-octane aviation fuel was gone. What filled the tanks of these Japanese fighters now? It was a volatile, dirty mixture adulterated with pine root oil, alcohol and low-grade substitutes. This garbage fuel burned erratically in the cylinders, causing the delicate and complex hum, our engine, to knock putter, and failed to reach anywhere near its designed performance. Imagine trying to pull a high-G maneuver to shake a Mustang off your tail, only for your engine to cough and lose power. That moment of despair is suffocating. Next came the collapse of materials and craftsmanship. The American Merle and engines were built in climate-controlled, dust-free factories by skilled technicians operating precision machine tools using top-tier heat-resistant alloys. The tolerances for every piston and bearing were measured in microns, and Japan, by this time skilled Japanese workers had long been drafted and sent to the front lines as cannon fodder. In dim makeshift underground factories, engines were being assembled by conscripted schoolgirls, farmers who had never touched machinery and Korean laborers who did not even speak the language, coupled with a critical shortage of rare metals. Components that required high-strength nickel-chrome alloys were replaced with ordinary steel. These substitute materials meant the engines had incredibly short lifespans, spark plugs fouled constantly, oil leaks were a daily occurrence. So that morning, when many Japanese pilots pushed their throttles forward with hearts full of patriotic furor, they tragically discovered that the divine sword in their hands was actually riddled with invisible microscopic cracks, and so the air battle began. Or to be more accurate, a unilateral hunt began. At 20,000 feet, the American Mustang formation used its superior high-altitude performance to claim the energy advantage. They did not need to engage in the complex horizontal, turning fights that the Zero had excelled in. They only needed to do one thing. Boom and zoom. Major Tapp and his comrades dived like falcons from the heavens, utilizing gravity to accelerate, screaming down into the Japanese formation. Their speed was so great that the Japanese gun turrets could not traverse fast enough to track them. The Mustangs slashed through and were gone before the enemy could react. In that split-second of intersection, the M2 heavy machine guns roared. The sky was filled with a crisscrossing web of fire. A Hayite attempting to climb and intercept found a Mustang glued to its 6 o'clock position. The Japanese pilot pulled back on the stick, desperately trying to use the Hayate's superior turning radius to reverse the situation. If he were fighting a heavy P-47 or an early Hellcat, he might have had a chance, but he was facing a P-51. The American pilot gently pulled back on his stick. The Mustang's laminar flow wings kept it incredibly agile, even in the thin, high-altitude air. Even more terrifying was that the Americans were now equipped with the K-14 gyro gun sight. This was a piece of black technology for its time. It automatically calculated the deflection angle needed to hit a moving target. The pilot no longer had to guess the lead by instinct. He simply had to keep the reticle on the enemy. In that instant, 6 streams of fire, as if guided by their own eyes, chiseled precisely into the fuselage of the Hayite. Aluminum shattered smoke poured out, and in mere seconds the aircraft, representing the pinnacle of Japanese aviation engineering, was reduced to a burning heap of scrap metal tumbling toward the earth. The radio channels were filled with the excited shouts of American pilots. It was the euphoria of a hunter in a game preserve. This was no longer a tense struggle with an uncertain outcome. It was a turkey shoot easy to the point of absurdity. The intense battle of April 7th lasted less than 45 minutes. When the results were tallied, even American intelligence officers were shocked. The Americans claimed dozens of Japanese aircraft shot down, while their own losses were negligible. The two Mustangs lost were largely attributed to ground anti-aircraft fire, not aerial combat. A kill ratio of 30-1, perhaps even higher. Behind these cold numbers lay the extinguishing of countless young Japanese lives, and the sound of the Imperial Japanese Air Force's spine finally snapping. This massive disparity was not just in the machines, but in the men. This was perhaps a gap even wider and more hopeless than the technological one. In the United States, before a P-51 pilot even stepped onto a carrier or arrived at an island base in the Pacific, he had undergone at least 250, sometimes up to 400 hours of systematic flight training in the safety of the continental U.S. They had unlimited fuel to burn. They had veteran aces who had returned from the front to serve as instructors, teaching the secrets of survival. They learned instrument flying, night formation, high deflection, shooting, and radio coordination. When they climbed into the cockpit, the plane was an extension of their body. They knew every switch and gauge by touch. Contrast this with Japan. By 1945, the elite pilots who had terrorized the skies over Pearl Harbor and Midway were long gone, their bones resting on the floor of the Pacific. Who was left to be stuffed into the cockpits now? Children. Many had fewer than 100 flight hours, some only a few dozen. They might have just learned how to take off and land before being told they were going up to fight the most powerful air force in the world. At this stage, Japan had canceled most tactical training because there was no fuel and no spare aircraft. These fresh-faced boys, under the despairing gaze of their instructors, learned a few simple maneuvers and were pushed into the sky. They were not pilots, they were flying sacrifices. It was an asymmetrical slaughter. A cruel game, pitting a professional heavyweight boxer against a toddler just learning to walk. Behind all of this stood the giant that drove the Axis powers to despair, the terrifying industrial productivity of the United States. When we marvel at the beautiful lines of the Mustang, we must remember that it is, at its core, the ultimate manifestation of Fordism applied to weapons of mass destruction. In Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, the massive factories of North American aviation burned with light day and night. Thousands of American women, the Rosie the Riveters, wore bandanas and held rivet guns, standing on massive moving assembly lines. They might not have understood aerodynamics, but they knew how to rivet aluminum sheets quickly and precisely. They were not handcrafting art, they were producing fighter jets the way a factory produces cans of Spam. At peak capacity, the American aviation industry was rolling out a brand new P-51 Mustang every single hour. Let that sink in. Every hour. This meant that even if frontline pilots crashed dozens of planes a day, the Liberty ships arriving from the rear brought even more replacements, piling them up on the tarmac. By the end of the war, the total production of all P-51 variants exceeded 15,000 units. This was a suffocating aesthetic of industrial violence, a strategy of drowning quality with sheer, overwhelming quantity. In comparison, Japanese aircraft factories were living in hell. Strategic bombing by B-29s had razed major industrial cities. The factories of Mitsubishi and Nakajima were twisted piles of rebar. Japanese workers had to disperse their precious machine tools to rural air raid shelters, school auditoriums, and even temple halls to continue production. This dispersed, cottage industry style of manufacturing was not only inefficient, but it also led to a fatal problem: parts were not interchangeable. If the landing gear on an American Mustang broke, the ground crew could grab a new one from a warehouse of 10,000 spares, and it would fit perfectly. But for the Japanese, a part from one plane might not fit another because every aircraft was essentially hand-customized in different workshops by different people with wildly different standards. The tolerances were comically bad. An American pilot if he did not like the feedback from his landing gear. Might dare to intentionally snap it on landing, knowing a brand new plane, smelling of fresh factory paint, would be waiting for him the next morning. A Japanese pilot dared not lose a single screw, for it was an irreplaceable resource. As time went on, the despair deepened. By the summer of 1945, the skies over Tokyo became strangely quiet. The Mustang pilots, originally tasked with escort, found themselves unemployed. There were no Japanese planes in the sky. The back of the Japanese Army and Navy Air Services had been completely broken. Every remaining plane was hidden under camouflage nets, tucked away in caves, hoarding strength for the so-called decisive battle on the homeland or for the final KKO suicide attacks. So these bored Mustang pilots began to find new forms of entertainment. They were no longer satisfied with high-altitude escort. They dropped down to the deck and began free roaming sweeps. This was a new kind of terror. Imagine the Grim Reaper who once hovered high above, now skimming the treetops. The Mustangs became demons of the low altitude. They strafed moving trains, turning locomotives into sieves with their .50 calibers and watching the steam boilers explode. They attacked trucks on country roads and even lone fishing boats at sea. There is a detail that is ironically telling. Late in the war, Mustang pilots began to save fuel on their way to Japan. Why? Because they realized that if they flew with the standard to drop tanks, they often arrived over Japan without even needing to drop them for combat. There was no need for violent maneuvering. They flew there with full tanks and flew back with full tanks. A display of aerial supremacy that was practically Versailles-like in its extravagance. On the ground, Japanese civilians could only cower in shelters, listening to the roar of engines skimming their rooftops. That sound no longer represented a battle, it represented absolute dominion, a conquest that could not be resisted. August 1945, the final moments arrived. Lieutenant Jerry Yelin, a young Mustang pilot, flew the very last combat mission of World War II. By this time, Japan was a ruin. The devastating mushroom clouds had already risen over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The tank columns of the Soviet Red Army were rushing the Kwantan Army in Manchuria. Yet, even in this moment, fanatical Japanese resistors tried to take to the air, attempting to throw their lives against the unstoppable wheels of history. Yell and S. Wingman, 19-year-old Philip S.C.H. Lamberg, disappeared during this final, and in many ways completely unnecessary, battle. It is speculated that he flew into the clouds to escape ground fire and never came out. Even on the eve of victory, the Reaper continued to harvest lives on schedule, illustrating the ultimate absurdity of war. When Emperor Hirohito's voice, crackling with static and speaking in an archaic, difficult-to-understand court dialect, broadcast the surrender to the world, scattered anti-aircraft fire still popped over Tokyo. Some Japanese could not accept defeats, some had not heard the news, but the ownership of the sky had changed hands long ago. Today, when we look back at that history, the P-51 Mustang flying over Tokyo is not just a military operation. It is a metaphor for an era, a specimen of how technological revolution changes the form of war. It marked the total bankruptcy of the Bushido spirit, which emphasized individual valor in the face of a cold, unfeeling torrent of steel. It marked the ruthless crushing of craftsmanship by industrial standardization. War was no longer a contest of courage. It was a contest of production capacity, a contest of technology, a contest of logistics. In Shizuoka Prefecture, Japan, there is a private museum. Resting there quietly is a restored P-51 Mustang. Its aluminum skin still gleaming coldly under the lights. Beside it perhaps lies the wreckage of a Zero, rusted and riddled with bullet holes. This is not just a display of two airplanes, it is a microcosm of the fate of two nations. A staring contest between two models of civilization. That Mustang with its Merlin engine still capable of roaring to life tells a brutal truth in modern warfare. There are no miracles when you look through your binoculars and see the enemy's single-engine fighters. Having crossed thousands of kilometers of ocean appearing calmly over your capital, you do not need to wait for the flash of the atomic bomb, nor the rumble of Soviet tank treads. You should already know all resistance, all slogans, all sacrifices are merely delaying an inevitable conclusion. It is a mathematical game of distance, technology, output, and despair. And in that game, the moment the P-51 Mustang shadowed Mount Fuji, the checkmate had already been delivered. If you found this analysis of the P-51 Mustang's domination over the Pacific theater fascinating, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more in-depth military history. Your support is the fuel that allows us to continue excavating these forgotten stories from the dust of history and decoding the logic behind the wars. I am your strategy observerant. I will see you on the next battlefield.